Liz.
Hey, Fran. Hey, Rodri.
Hey, Fran. Hey, Liz.
Welcome back, everybody, to Rooted Conversations. In this episode, we're going to be talking about climate change and its effects on the survival of civilization. This is a really important episode for us because it really sets the foundation for why we each take this work so seriously and what really brought us forward more than anything else. And because of the importance of this episode, we've asked Fran to really walk us through the primary kind of core elements of climate crisis, so kind of a climate crisis 101, so that all of us here are on a shared platform of understanding so that we can move forward into some deeper conversations. So next week, we're going to actually touch on the religious and cultural responses to this topic, but first we wanted to really set a firm foundation. So Fran, can you walk us through that?
I sure can. Thanks. This is, in a way, the core of everything that BioEarth does and what we really want to make sure everybody else knows. Because climate change is happening. It is caused by humans. It needs to be drastically addressed by humans in order for our civilization to thrive. This is not just my view. This is the view of 97% of the world's climate scientists. This is no longer a contested view in most quarters. Any source that is saying that it is still undecided has not followed the science in the last 10 years. In fact, multiple lines of evidence establish that climate change is happening at an unprecedented rate. We have sea level rise. We have acidification of the oceans, resulting in over 75% of the world's coral being bleached. We have sea level temperature that's rising. We have the air temperature that's rising. We have the temperature over land and sea, that is, water vapor. We have a decrease in glaciers and ice sheets and snow cover and sea ice. Species are migrating. So species that found a niche in one place are moving as the climate changes locally. We have an increase in some species. As we all know, viruses flourish, but also mosquitoes, which is quite dangerous, and rats and other insects. We also have massive species extermination, in part due to climate change, as well as other impacts. Even though extinction is a somewhat natural cycle, this is at 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction. We are losing between 150 and 200 species a day.
Oh my gosh.
But wait, some of our listeners might be saying, doesn't this happen every once in a long period in Earth's history? And in fact, yes, it did happen in the Pleistocene age when carbon dioxide was released through natural processes, but that resulted in the dinosaurs dying and the majority of life on Earth dying. And so now we are the ones that are releasing this carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases at an unprecedented rate. And if history does teach us, if geologic history does teach us anything, it's that this massive amount of release of carbon dioxide has a terrible effect on life across the entire planet. I'd like to bring everybody's attention to a report that we have on our website, the IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a team that has assembled thousands and thousands of scientific reports vetted by the best scientists in the world, and then released to policymakers and the public. But many people in the public haven't read it. The big report is pretty heady science, but the policymaker report really does boil things down. And so if I can hit a couple highlights of that, it is really important to understand that in 2014, that report suggested that we needed to keep the overall global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's Celsius, in order to avoid a critical 2 degree rise in Celsius globally by the end of the century. And in order to do that, many countries agreed to the Paris Climate Treaty. Otherwise, we would overshoot this disastrous level. Well, we are overshooting this disastrous level. And so the 1 degree mark, which just a few years ago we passed, is now in the rearview mirror. And we are coming up on 2 degrees. In fact, the new IPCC report that is coming out in 2021, as well as the United Nations Climate Report, predicts that we are now on course by the end of the century for what was previously thought to be the doomsday scenario for the planet, which is 4 degrees Celsius. Now that's global average temperature. So locally, it can be much greater. So for instance, near the equator, it's going to be much greater, where Congo is, much greater. Also, the poles will feel disproportionate effects as well. So for instance, the Antarctic ice sheet is under great stress. The Arctic is under great stress. And so even what I'm about to tell you is not taking into account what happens if we reach certain what are called tipping points, runaway cycles that we cannot predict the outcome of, including the melting of the Arctic and the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets, which is already starting to occur. So I want to take a minute to show you what an increase of 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century would look like in terms of sea level rise. One of our favorite resources is a website called Surging Seas. And by way of demonstration, I've chosen where I used to live, which is also coincidentally a huge military complex for the United States, and that is Newport News, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, what's known as Tidewater. I would like to show you what this looks like after a 4 degree rise in global temperature. Keep your eyes on Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, and Virginia Beach, a major site for the U.S. military. That's what happens by the end of this century to this area with a 4 degree rise in Celsius global temperature. And so in some scenarios that have been calculated, we're not looking at a 5 or 6 foot rise in sea level, but an eventual 29 foot rise, which of course would be catastrophic. It's for this reason that the United Nations, as well as other very reputable organizations, are predicting up to 500 million climate migrants even by the middle of our century.
Wow.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
It is hard even to talk about because I think that you are experiencing it as you're naming it, and I think it's okay to say that because that's what people are feeling. Like my stomach dropped when you showed that map. So
even talking about this is always very emotional for me. These, of course, aren't just scientific data that we're looking at. These are lives. We are in what scientists call the 6th mass extinction. Since 1970, we've lost, on average, 60% of wildlife populations. Obviously, the first and largest consequence of massive climate change is heat stress. And I can't recommend this book more highly, by Mark Linus, Our Final Warning, which spells out for lay people at each degree what the globe looks like. And at 4 degrees global temperature rise by the end of the century, the world is completely different. Civilization isn't necessarily over, but it's got to rapidly change to address these challenges. Southeast Asia is largely uninhabitable. The Middle East is largely uninhabitable. Large parts of China, largely uninhabitable. The southern United States is in large part more like Death Valley. Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, all of these states will have months and months over 100 degrees. But what's also important is something called the wet bulb temperature, which is a combination of humidity and heat stress that make parts of the planet uninhabitable, because we would have to have air conditioners to cool us because we can't sweat enough to regulate our body temperature. But of course, we're not the only ones that need to live. It also means extinction for even more mammals, even more species. It means drought in some areas, water contamination in some areas as the aquifers dry up, and you might have saltwater intrusion from oceans. But it also means localized flooding in other areas because the rainfall patterns change. Some parts of the winter actually become colder. There is a rise in disease, a rise in pollution, a rise in allergies, a decrease in air quality, more frequent mudslides, a much greater number of wildfires, and a much greater level of hurricanes. This year, 2020 has brought us so much to keep us preoccupied with concern and worry, but not many people have commented on the fact that we have gone through the alphabet naming hurricanes, and that is a trend that will continue. But there's another effect of all of this that we don't often consider, which does have to do with scarcity of resources. It does have to do with hundreds of millions of people being displaced and losing their home. And it does have to do with heat stress, and that's increased violent conflict. Whenever we have a scarcity of resources, we have more propensity for coming into conflict with one another. And that's one of the reasons why BioEarth is so concerned to work out mechanisms for intergroup harmony. BioEarth is a nonpartisan organization, but we also feel that it's important to examine politics and policy in order to understand how we are addressing climate change as a society, especially in the United States. The U.S. is the second largest producer currently of greenhouse gases, and historically we have been the largest polluter. So our climate policy has a disproportionate effect on the globe. In the last 4 years, the Trump administration has rolled back over 100 EPA regulations. They have repealed the Clean Power Act, which addresses smokestack emissions of carbon dioxide, expanded reliance on fossil fuels, placed fossil fuel representatives in key positions, including the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and the EPA. Announced in fall of 2020 that they would open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for additional oil and gas drilling. Rebooted old coal plants, allowing methane gas to escape into the atmosphere. Disbanded the White House Office of Science. Removed climate change data from EPA websites. And most importantly, suggested a rollback of tailpipe emissions scheduled to take place in 2021, which would result in 8 billion more tons of carbon dioxide. So this is not a partisan issue. Climate should be a bipartisan issue. As we record this episode, the President-elect of the United States is Joe Biden, who has promised to rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty. But it's going to take a lot of steps, a lot of big steps and a lot of little steps, and a multi-solving approach for all of us to become more resilient in the face of the climate crisis that will come. We can try to mitigate the scale of climate change. But even if we were to stop all carbon dioxide today, it would still take hundreds of years for the levels of greenhouse gases to return to pre-industrial levels. Therefore, we have to make ourselves more resilient. And in the next episode, we'll be talking about religious and cultural ways that we can find this resiliency to meet these challenges. Well, I have covered some very heavy material here today, And I love to hear just a little bit from you, Liz, and from you, Rodrigue, about your reactions, because it was actually difficult for me to talk about this because I have a strong reaction to it, even though I've been studying this for decades. So I'd like to know, how does this hit you as you hear about this once again?
Oh, well, I mean, I think my first impulse is always to kind of detach from the information and think about it in a more intellectual way. So I notice I remove my body and my vulnerability from the conversation. And one of the things that we at BioEarth remind ourselves of a lot is to come back to our bodies and to speak from that place. And my body feels anxious and my stomach is kind of turning in knots, and I'm thinking about all of my coastal relatives and all of the deep love I have for our more than human world, the animals that I grew up inspired by, and just really, I think grief is the thing that comes up the most when we go into this, and grief is the first thing that I think we try to distance ourselves from. I know I avoid it, and so it's easier to intellectualize than to feel. But, this is not something that we will wait until it's been 100 years and then we'll see the effects. This is something that's going to be unfolding, is already unfolding. I'm in wildfire country out in the western part of the United States, and we're seeing the worst fire seasons in history every single year. Every single season is the worst yet. And I'm lucky to live in a community that is coming together across all sorts of different kinds of identities in order to build a plan for community resilience. And that's something that I think BioEarth is poised to do more broadly across more communities. As I was watching you show the map and watching that water rise up over that community and thinking about all of the people, all the neighborhoods, all the infrastructure, all of the businesses, all of the pets that are affected, I think about that happening in coastal places all over our country. I think about the way that we saw an entire community obliterated by Hurricane Katrina and by many hurricanes since then, and thinking about that at even larger scales. And I just don't know that we're prepared emotionally, intellectually, or spiritually to fathom that and to metabolize that level of destruction enough to feel confident taking action. And that's one of the reasons I'm looking forward to our conversation next week, so we can talk more about community and individual strategies for ecological grief work, but also just for conversations around this so that we can get more information out and more strategies for action in place to build resilience.
That's exactly right. That's so important that we're not ending with this news. This is the starting point for all of us. Understanding the scientific data is something we feel that everyone needs to embrace, but that is our starting point. We don't want to ignore it. What we want to do is say, now that we know that, how do we build resiliency? And how do we do that on an individual level, on a community level, on a religious level, within religions, and across religions, and across cultures, and across ethnic groups, and across nations?
Speaking of climate resilience, that one of the things that the world would have to include, different aspects of our everyday activities, including financial opportunities to keep people from, winding up in exploited labors, and it will really have to be very inclusive, including women's empowerment programs, sustainable land use, will include peacebuilding, which is one of the most important aspects of this challenging situation. Regenerative agriculture and farming activities would also be a way to really play a significant role in the climate change challenges. Things like food insecurity, and just speaking from the Congolese perspective, water scarcity and natural disasters, and many other challenges that we're facing in the world right now are among the effects of climate change. And those are things that people have to understand, that the planet is at risk. So we have to take serious steps to mitigating climate degradation and making sure that everybody, as Francis said before, a multi-solving approach is really necessary from the bottom up and top down. Everybody has to be involved in the process if we really want to make a change in our community. And BioEarth is really taking this seriously. That's why we're here talking today.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Rooted Conversations. As you can tell, this one was a heavy topic for each of us to hold, and we're really grateful to Fran for carrying all of this data forward. It's a big undertaking, and it's something that we have more information about on our website. We're trying to keep up to date with climate crisis data and what's coming out of the UN and other places of trusted information. So go ahead and check that out. And we're always here to answer questions and go deeper. And we'll see you next week for a conversation about the religious and cultural responses and adaptive solutions that are emerging in communities already. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much. Bye.